Let's dive more into the stunning fall of SBF with Ari Redbord, who is the TRM Labs of legal, head of legal and government affairs. He's also the former senior advisor to the deputy secretary at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. Given the many agencies that are going to be involved, and even across different jurisdictions here, where do you expect that one agency may take the lead over another, and who will hold the priority of really looking into the information that needs to come in this downfall of FTX?
Yeah, no, first, thanks so much for having me. And that was an excellent synopsis of all this going on by Alexis in a very complicated environment. And I think that just to start, the short answer to your question is it's usually the Department of Justice. I spent about 11 years as a federal prosecutor, and I can tell you that oftentimes sort of civil cases out of the SEC or other regulators or even sort of by plaintiffs are sort of put on the back burner pending criminal charges because a defendant really can't speak or be deposed or be involved in civil litigation if there is a pending criminal charge. Because as Alexis mentioned, obviously, when you're talking about criminal charges, you're talking about potential jail time. And in this case, you're talking about some really potential significant jail time, given what likely the guidelines, the federal sentencing guidelines will be in this case. So it will absolutely be DOJ. And I think we're going to learn a lot more really, probably over the course of today as to what the exact criminal charge is and then ultimately what the exposure is. But sort of given my experience, wire fraud, securities fraud, money laundering make a lot of sense here. And we'll be looking at some pretty significant federal sentencing guidelines.
Ari, it's Julie here. What I've been trying to wrap my head around while this is going on, because obviously there are going to be congressional hearings today and tomorrow from House and Senate committees. There's been a lot of talk about regulation, but fraud is fraud, right? So I've just been trying to figure out if different regulation had been in place, would this have prevented this alleged fraud? Or, I mean, there were laws in place and Bernie Madoff did what he did and Elizabeth Holmes did what she did. So I'm just trying to sort of separate the two.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right with the sort of tone of the question. And that is there are laws today in the United States that sort of protect consumers and investors against this type of activity. You're always going to have fraud and financial crime out there, as you just mentioned. But this case really is more akin to an Enron or a Lehman or a case that just involved sort of mismanagement of a centralized business, right? Business happened to be engaged in the custodying and trading of cryptocurrency. However, that was really the only crypto angle to it. This was not a decentralized protocol. This was not a true sort of blockchain based business. And what you see here is just the mismanagement that you've always seen. One really important flag here is that FTX was not a U.S. business. It was a entity that was based in the Bahamas. So a lot of sort of these U.S. laws that would have applied, potentially didn't apply. And that's why we have in place today in the U.S. consumer protection laws. We have investor protection laws. Every state has a money transmitter law that really covers a lot of what we saw here today. And then honestly, what we're seeing right now from DOJ and SEC, we're seeing fraud and securities type of laws. So yes, laws are already in place today. Don't get me wrong. The cryptocurrency space needs more regulatory clarity, and we're going to absolutely see that sort of in the U.S. In my mind, in 2023, as we kind of move forward, whether it's on stablecoin regulation or other sort of pieces of sort of a broader framework for cryptocurrencies, businesses need more clarity. But this case is really not one of those cases that clarity would have necessarily applied to.
Ari, you mentioned a moment ago the potential for significant federal sentencing guidelines. What might they look like here for SBF, and how would you compare it to what happened to Bernie Madoff?
Yeah, I've not admittedly done sort of the calculation, and it's pretty complicated. But one thing that drives the federal sentencing guidelines, and they are not mandatory anymore, but most judges follow them. And the amount of fraud involved in a case, just the pure number, is something that really drives the guideline range. And here we're talking about potentially unprecedented numbers. So we're going to see, a very high guideline range. Now, that said, that range can go down by certain mitigating factors. For example, will there be cooperation in the case? And you ask, well, what could he cooperate on, right? He was the highest level executive. Well, I think one of the things that prosecutors are really going to be focused on here, and something that I always focused on as a prosecutor, was restitution for the victims. We want to ensure that that there's a victim-centered approach here, and that we go after these funds. And if there's any way for the defendant here to help prosecutors and investigators find or discover or recover funds for victims, that may be a mitigating factor. So lots and lots to happen here and try to figure out before we ever get anywhere near a sentence. But we're looking at very significant time.
Yes, we'll be following that to see, and we'll be looking forward to that DOJ complaint actually being unsealed so we can get more details on that. Ari Redbord, thank you so much for your perspective on this. TRM Labs, Head of Legal and Government Affairs. Appreciate it.